A protest in China against the country's strict COVID policy showing no sign of stopping. They enter a third day as a rally took place early this morning in Beijing, while scuffles broke out earlier in Shanghai.
The protests have turned political, calling for leadership change. From east to west, these are some of the key cities hit by the wave of dissent, including Urumqi, capital of Xinjiang province. That's where a deadly fire blamed on strict lockdowns but denied by officials is said to have triggered the protests.
At midnight cries for freedom in Beijing, at least 1,000 people gathered in the capital, refusing to disperse, many of them holding blank papers, a symbolic protest against censorship. They want the government to ease up on COVID measures.
我认为我们只需要去找到他的这个密接、次密接以及这些有可能感染的人，这就够了。我们不需要去进行全小区的一个大型的这种筛查，我们不需要这种大清洗。
Tension spilled over in Shanghai, police detaining several people. The BBC claims one of its journalists was beaten, kicked and detained for several hours, causing extreme concern. Many in the crowd vented their anger at the police.
你们有工作，你们这样工作人没有工作吗？
你们有工作，你们能吃饭，你们能赚钱，我们呢？我们呢？老子掏钱养3年呢。
The Shanghai protest took place as Urumqi Road, named after Urumqi, the lightning rod for the latest demonstrations. Police were seen removing the road sign in what some say was a bit to remove the symbolism of the place and minimize protests. For more, CNA's Lu Min is joining us live. Min, some remarkable scenes in China are seeing. Tell us about the mood on the ground and give us a scale of what's happening.
Well, it's been absolutely surreal and in some ways an unbelievable weekend that unfolded in China. It does seem as if the country is on a tipping point with protests breaking out in various cities across the country, ranging from Beijing and Shanghai to Lanzhou and Wuhan. And tens of thousands of people had turned up on the streets based on social media footage that we've seen. And it's remarkable that these protesters, they didn't just chant for an end to lockdown and to COVID-19 swab tests, calling for freedom and human rights, but they also chanted, Communist Party step down, Xi Jinping step down. And these chanting, they go on for hours. And I must point out how extraordinary that is for the protesters to criticize not just the policies, but also the regime itself and President Xi himself, just 5 weeks after the president was confirmed for a record-breaking third term in office. He had presented himself as a picture of unchallenged authority in the country, but now that facade is breaking under the scale of these protests. Many of these protests, they didn't start out as such. In Shanghai, for instance, it was a solemn and silent event. People came bearing flowers and candles to mourn the dead, and they raised up blank pieces of white paper in protest against censorship. And many of these protesters, they are taking immense personal risks. They could face jail time or worse. But clearly, 3 years of zero COVID policy have pushed people to their breaking point.
Yeah, and Min, how have authorities been responding to the protests?
Well, I think what's really remarkable about these protests so far is that is the restraint that the police have shown. For example, in Shanghai, the police had blockaded the streets where the protests were taking place and they had formed a human wall, but they had refrained from using violence immediately to disperse the crowd. In one video, the police could be seen negotiating with protesters, calling them to go home to mourn for the dead in their hearts. On Sunday, the police was using loudspeakers to disperse the crowd, and later we saw some scuffles, some pushing and shoving between protesters and police, the police converging on some protesters, pinning them to the wall, pushing them, dragging them away into police cars. Some had been taken away and beaten up, but still, even with that large police presence, compared to what we've seen in protests in Guangzhou and Zhengzhou in recent weeks, this was relatively peaceful. In Guangzhou and Zhengzhou, there had been police in anti-riot gear, wielding shields and sticks and beating people up. In Beijing, a journalist had asked the police if they're going to use tear gas on the people, and the police simply said, please go home. Now, we don't know how long these protests are going to last for, and experts say that President Xi is unlikely to tolerate dissent for a long time. So if it gets uncontrollable, they cannot rule out that the regime could resort to using the armed forces to quash the protesters.